Thank you. It is. Great. Thank you. So it's my honour and great pleasure this evening to be in conversation with my friend Sophie Cunningham about this tremendous novel, This Devastating Fever. On an earlier reading, I described this novel as thrillingly audacious, and my subsequent reading confirms and deepens my admiration for this book. It examines complex subjects. To name just a few: colonialism, the natural world, environmental collapse, the concept of family, the creative life, the long reach of the past. It finds inventive, playful, I would say almost joyful ways of distilling a vast factual archive and integrating that material deftly into a fictive scheme. It mashes up times and places, realism and surrealism, history and speculation, and often blurs those concepts. That's a breathtakingly risky thing to do, but the great achievement of this novel is to succeed beautifully in that gamble. The result is profound, exciting, moving, original, and sometimes very funny. So the novel essentially consists of two strands. One, an exo-fiction, a word I learned recently, and I'm so pleased to have.
I don't know what it means.
It's fiction about a real person.
All right. Okay.
Exo-fiction. Learnt it in France. Exo-fiction, for the third time, about Leonard Woolf. And the other is a meta or possibly auto-fiction about writing a novel about Leonard Woolf. And these two strands meet and converge, meet and diverge and converge again in a way that brings Escher to mind. So Sophie, congratulations on this fabulous book. Would you mind reading from it to get our conversation going?
I will, but I couldn't have written this book without you, Michelle, but we can talk about that more later. Okay, so this is from a Leonard section, and it's set in 1910. When the Rinderpest hit, it had the force of a cyclone, and Leonard learnt just how quickly things could unravel. Jurisprudence rendered him powerless. All he could do was watch people go about their work between his district and the next, then wait until bulls dragging carts full of salt to Hambantota staggered into the local herd. And that was that. Leonard issued orders that cattle be tethered. He personally shot the cattle of villagers who disobeyed him. He even shot 2 bullocks owned by a man he thought of as a friend, while that man pleaded with him and lay prostrate against the bullocks' across the bullocks' bodies. By the time that scene was over, half the village was gathered around him, and Leonard thought for a moment that he was going to be stoned. It was Mr. Nalaparuma who finally saved Leonard and pulled him away from the crowd. "Come," he said, leading Leonard to the local tank. "I have something to show you." Despite all that had happened, Leonard was unprepared for the scene before them. Dead bullocks lay everywhere, many of them on the water's edge, infecting the water supply. Further along the tank lay several sambar deer. One hapless bullock, its face half-eaten by maggots, blundered past. Leonard got out his gun, took aim and fired. A large beast, it seemed to take several minutes to register the blow and then die. This is what hell looks like, or would look like if I believed in it. Mr. Nalaparuma explained that when a bullock was struck ill, it ran wildly. The dying animal could cover long distances in its final days. Why, Leonard asked? So as to die where it was born. But surely not all these bullocks were born here. This is an example of evolution at work, of cunning, a virus evolving so as to ensure maximum chance of survival. I'm not a believer in evolution. Mr. Nalaparuma's smile was strained. He did not think now was the time for conversation, was deeply concerned by the terrible losses the village was sustaining. But I think we can agree that these bullocks will soon be dead. As they stood by the waterhole surrounded by dead animals, the red of a mongoose's eye flashed in the corner of Leonard's vision before darting into the belly of a pig. The men moved close to inspect the carcass. Pigs couldn't catch rinderpest. To judge by the mauling, a leopard had killed it, then feasted before leaving the scraps for the other pigs. "Sir," Mr. Nalaparuma said, "this leopard is killing the few animals we have left." There are more cheerful bits. I think I might leave it at that. Rinderpest is it's a bit like foot and mouth or something. But it was quite amazing reading his diaries about plague back then, and how quickly everything could change within minutes, within days. That I found really interesting, particularly in light of recent events.
Thank you for reading that passage. So Leonard Woolf, as a young man in his 20s, post-Cambridge, goes out to, joins the civil service, the colonial service, and goes out to Ceylon for several years, 7 years, something like that.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the effect of being a colonial administrator, being part of that system on Leonard, and also the effect of the country on him?
Yeah. Well, as an older man, he talked, and he lived to be 90, so he really did get to be an older man. He talked about the strangeness of being basically a kid out of college, being given half a country to run. Like, he had no idea what he was doing, and he was very aware. He was a smart man. He was very aware that he had no idea what he was doing. And so, on the one hand, he worked very hard to be an excellent administrator. On the other hand, he was really registering how appalling the colonial system was. So he was quite an unusual... He was enacting imperialism. He was a fairly brutal administrator, but he was also just terribly aware that it was an incredibly unfair system. So this double think and this constant critiquing and political sensibility really started to develop in Sri Lanka. But he also just was incredibly moved by the country. He found it incredibly beautiful and a huge relief to escape England, the class system, and indeed the anti-Semitism. He came from a lower middle class Jewish family, and where Semitism was just sort of part of every anti-Semitism was part of his everyday. And so he found a freedom there, which is complicated, because it's like using another country to be a way of finding yourself without always being respectful of the ways in which you use the people when you are finding yourself. But it was incredibly liberating for him.
Yeah. And it was an interest that he carried. I mean, after he left Ceylon and he left the civil service, he said he couldn't be part of that system any longer. And he became an advocate, did he not, for independence?
He did, and he continued relationships with Ceylonese and then Sri Lankan people as they became known.
I think he died before it became Sri Lanka.
Right. You picked that up on the proofs, didn't you? Yes. And he became more and more strident and anti-empire and anti-imperialism the older he got, and he had very meaningful relationships with people that he knew from Ceylon, which most of his British friends just sort of mocked slightly.
Including Virginia Woolf.
Virginia was appalling about it. She just talked about his black
Leonard's
friends.
Darkies. I will never forget coming across that moment in the diaries, this woman whom I'd been taught to revere, whom I did revere, and you feel as if you have missed a step on the stairs. The lurch is physical.
She was incredibly racist. She became less so over the years, but still.
Yes. Yeah, no, he was a very admirable person in so many ways, I think.
In fact, Lytton Strachey, he wrote a novel called The Village in the Jungle, which you might well be about to ask me about.
Yes.
But Lytton Strachey did describe it as a novel with too many blacks in it. So it wasn't just Virginia.
Yeah, no, it wasn't just Virginia. But the thing that always strikes me about Leonard, and which is different from Virginia, is that, Virginia Woolf, wrote brilliantly about the female condition. But that was because she was part of that. Whereas he had the ability to write about the suffering of people who were not like him.
Yep.
In, for instance, The Village in the Jungle.
Yeah.
So do.
Well, that's a radical novel. So to my mind, it is a better novel than A Passage to India or Heart of Darkness, novels to which it's been compared. But it's written totally from the point of view of Sri Lankan characters, which is incredibly radical back then. And it is still in print. It has been in print and he is incredibly, well, he's revered in Sri Lanka. It's not that there hasn't been criticism of him, so because he was a colonial administrator, but that novel and he are revered as one of the few few English people that actually saw them and took them seriously. Yeah. So it was. And it is an it's an unnerving novel to read. It's also about sexuality in a very kind of intense and slightly weird way as well. Yeah. And the jungle and nature.
And nature and the jungle. But also, I mean, it's not just that it's about the local people, but it's the poorest of the poor. I mean, these villagers who are just scratching a living. So that, I mean, made it also very unusual.
Yes, and he was a mentor to Ian Forster, and I don't actually know if he had anything to do with Conrad, but he ended up being the sort of, until his autobiographies, when he was a really old man, he was always sort of a bit like an editor. He was kind of the mentor or the carer, and very much in the background. Not so much with people who read his political writings, like in newspapers, but he was not taken seriously, and that also interested me because it's a gender reversal, but in the way that women who are carers don't get taken seriously, he had the same problem because he was a man who was a carer.
Yes.
And there's something, maybe it's more obvious the unfairness of that because he's a man and we take it more for granted that women do care. But anyway, he's very interesting.
Yeah, that's a really good point actually about the nursing that he had to do with Virginia. But let's talk about the other strand of the novel and Alice. So if I understand it correctly, I mean, you set out to write this book about Leonard Woolf. But then at some point, this other character comes in, who is Alice Fox, who's a contemporary, Australian writer who's writing this novel about Leonard. So at what point, what made Alice appear? What
you made Alice appear?
Sophie, we have different versions of the past and
I was struggling to make the novel come to life because he was so interesting. Virginia was so interesting. There was so much history. There were so many archives. I was sort of drowning in the real material, and it was very hard to actually find the story. Just because something's interesting doesn't mean it's a good novel at all. And I was really struggling to find the story in it.
Yeah.
And while I had written some very interesting passages about them, they hadn't gelled into a novel. Mm-hmm. And you were one of the few people brave enough to tell me that.
Right.
And even though quite a few readers did kind of... And then I sort of put it aside and cried. And, but I kind of agreed, right? And this is sort of a long-winded answer. But then the pandemic happened, and I'd read The Plague. Many of us will have read The Plague, and I reread The Plague. And there's a character in The Plague called Grand who writes and rewrites the opening of his novel for years on end. And then he gets the plague. And I just thought, I'm turning into this, I'm just going to die of the plague. You know, this isn't the high drama. I think we can all remember that, the sense of high drama at the beginning of the pandemic. And there's something about it just made me think, excuse my language, fuck it. And I just sat down, I just wrote it. I just sat down and I wrote it, and I just sort of channeled the character who became Alice she has some aspects of me, but is not just me at all.
No.
And I just stopped worrying about whether it was fiction or non-fiction. I couldn't really remember, to be honest, exactly what had happened to Leonard or to Virginia, because which was useful because I was not obsessing about
you needed
what
to forget
really happened.
the research, really. Yeah.
And I'd done the research so long ago at that point that I could kind of let go of it and just let Alice have her breakdown on the page. A breakdown aided by environmental collapse and COVID, not just her personal neuroses, I would say.
But so what did this metafictional character, I mean, apart from the fact that it meant that you could forget the research, forget about Leonard and forget about worrying about whether you'd got it right. What did the appearance of Alice, what did that allow you to do, writing that character, writing that strand? What did it allow you to do that a straight exo-fiction about Leonard would not have?
It allowed me to draw out the parallels between the past and the present in a really explicit way. So, and the moment that really did happen to me, that is in sort of a version of is in the book, was walking. I'm lucky enough to live in central Melbourne, and I was walking through the exhibition gardens to the exhibition buildings to get my vaccine. And it was very emotional. It was only like a 100-metre walk, but it's like that sense of being in the middle of history. Like this was like vaccines had just been, we'd been in lockdown for, I don't know, whatever, very long time. And so everyone was a bit crazy. And then a plane went overhead, and I was like, a plane, wow. and we really had no sense of what was going to happen next. And I just suddenly thought, this is what it's like to live in the middle of history. How are people going to think about this in 50 years? Like that sense that everything has changed, which I got a bit of during the Black Summer bushfires, which were that sense of entering climate change was very distressing and motivating as a writer, like that sense of urgency. But then the pandemic added to that. So it just, and then I actually added quite a bit more about Virginia and her getting the flu 100 years previously, and that was interesting in itself because a lot of her symptoms are not dissimilar to long COVID or, like a weak heart, emotional, cognitive issues. So I just started to understand the damage these viruses can do and did 100 years ago. And the more I learnt about her, the more I thought there's a lot of talk about, she was a bit crazy and that's why she committed suicide. Well, a combination of she had the flu several times. And then during World War II, if I could just let, in the months before her death, I hadn't understood until I did the research that it really did seem that the Germans were going to cross the Channel. I interviewed people who were digging trenches on the beaches and that was news to me, and because history is written by the victors, etc. And Leonard was Jewish, and they knew that they would be put into camps, and they were actually discussing what they would do. So it's in that context that she chose to end her life. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't other issues, but I just mean I started to understand the way that history interacts with decisions that get... people reflect on them in ways that are often about their own agenda.
And I suppose what happens, the way you live when you don't know what the end is. We know what the end of the Second World War was, and they didn't.
Yes.
And that's what you were experiencing with...
Yeah. They had discussions. It was in various... within his autobiographies about, whether they'd use car exhaust and could they get their hands on cyanide. But it wasn't just them. Everyone was talking about it, even people who weren't Jewish. So it was... so that sense of my own experience and then writing into that with the Alice Fox character of what it is like to feel as if the world is ending, even though the world is not actually ending, which is kind of, because as the writing went on, it became clear the pandemic was going to go on and on and on. And then I thought, how am I going to end this book? Because I was like this is actually going to go on for a decade. So, it'll change over time. It's so I ended up choosing the earthquake, which in Melbourne was a big deal. It was actually like light relief, frankly. It was hilarious. But there was actually quite a major earthquake, which was quite energising.
How we talk about, in a cliched way, that, a writer is haunted by her material and her characters. And I love the way you take that cliche and you literalise it.
Yeah.
And so Alice has these conversations with the ghost of Leonard and with the ghost of Virginia. What did having those ghosts allow you to do?
It allowed me to have, allowed Alice to have conversations that I was having in my head about how do you write history, to grapple with some of the identity politics working on a project like this raised. And Virginia is an interesting case because she certainly was the most written about woman in the world. I think Princess Diana has probably eclipsed that. But I just read so many theories about her, and which was kind of she had mental health issues because she was only breastfed for 6 weeks. I was only breastfed for 6 weeks. Like she was a lesbian, she wasn't a lesbian, she was this, she was that. Everyone had a theory about her, and I don't even remember where I was going with that. I'm sorry.
No. So I think what you're saying is that it allowed you to, through these conversations, you could speculate.
So she has arguments. That's right. She has arguments with Alice about you, because and Victoria Glendinning in her biography of Leonard writes about this very well. When I first started the project, I was very interested to know about their sex life or their lack of sex life. And then over time I realised it was absolutely irrelevant. What was relevant was their commitment to each other, the nature of, the loyalty, the way they grew close to each other. And people would often say that, Vita Sackville-West was her great love. Well, Vita Sackville-West was not her great love. They were incredibly close friends. They adored each other. But, Vita was having affairs with other women when she was very close to Virginia. And Virginia was well aware that Vita was bad news on that front, that she was a serial seducer of married women who she would then fling and say, sorry, I have to go, fling away and say, I have to go back to Harold now. And broke people's hearts. And Virginia was actually smart enough to dodge that bullet. So I just, there was something, she was written about as a victim in a way that I didn't think was appropriate. Yeah. And writing about her as a ghost, having her kind of arguing and being very alive, allowed me to give her a vibrancy. Because she'd say, this is ridiculous, this passage is ridiculous, I have no idea what you're saying about me, this is crap. Which I could very much, it was very easy for me to imagine her saying those things.
Virginia and Alice's agent, they seem to be,
Now, my actual agent is here tonight, Jane. And I love Jane, and about 20 people, though, have asked me, is Sarah Jane? And Sarah is not Jane. Because Sarah is, apart from anything else, 30 years older than Jane. But there was one, I stole one line from a conversation with Jane, but Sarah is a mashup of that amazing generation of women I worked with, who are now in their 70s and 80s in publishing, who are incredibly direct and feisty. And so Sarah is a kind of real blended character of all those women.
Good. Well, let's talk about blends and mash-ups, because the book really does leap about in time and space and place, and which is fantastic. It's this really sort of complicated, intricate mosaic, and I'm just wondering how you arrived. How did you decide this is coming first, this is coming second?
I basically. I lost my mind. I was basically sat in bed for 3. I was in Mount Macedon. The fireplace had broken. We were in lockdown, And I just got up at 6 every morning and just typed, and I really can barely remember it. And in fact, I remember sending Jane one draft and her saying, it's good, we need to think about this or that, and then seeing the next draft and she's like, what happened? And I was like, I don't know what happened. I think I lost my mind. Because time did become elastic. I don't know if people felt this during the pandemic. I mean, even now, I bump into someone and say, oh, I haven't seen you for a year, and I realise it's actually 4 years since I've seen them, because there's that big hole in time. It did kind of change everything.
But I was wondering whether you sort of printed it all out and then had bits of paper on the floor. Or...
No, I used Scrivener and do lots of
technological.
I did move. I mean, towards the end of the book, Alice loses control. Like, she starts to intervene. So the kind of conceit, if you like, is that there's Alice's story and then there's her writing about Leonard. And then towards the end, it's just like she just interrupts scenes which are meant to be set in 1950 or 1960 because she... And starts talking about the plight of Sri Lankan refugees today, and like she just can't really keep the material corralled anymore.
Yeah.
And I was just trying to capture that, because the relationship between the past and the present was becoming so real and alive. It's actually there's a sequence in the book which I think possibly a couple of people thought was an unusual. It was about pesticides.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And that was part of what I was trying to do with that scene. Was, I mean, Leonard lived until 1970, which meant he was alive for the publication of Silent Spring. He was involved in conversations about pesticides. He's been complaining about pesticides use since the 1940s. And I was listening to things on the radio about whether or not particular pesticides should be used. And I'm thinking, like, this conversation has literally been had for 70 years, like like every time it's the first time. And it makes you start to feel crazy. And like, people can say the same things over and over again. So he was getting worked up about exactly the same things I was getting worked up. So that also allowed me I was getting worked up about. So that kind of helped me mash up time as well, because I do feel that some conversations just don't seem to resolve. And fascism, in the 30s, fascism now, interesting sexual and gender fluid politics being very relevant to their lives, being very relevant now. Yeah.
So one of the things that strikes me is the way that you, would strike any reader, I think, is the way that you, this blend of forms and modes. So there's the Leonard strand, the Alice strand. You have footnotes, which are used very inventively and wonderfully and very funnily at times, and lists, and it's all kind of putting pressure on the traditional realist novel. And I think it's interesting to me that just in recent years there seems to have been a lot of interest in doing that with by writers. So, just in Australia, I'm thinking of sort of Christos Tsiolkas's 7.5.
These Scary Monsters.
And, Michael Winkler's Grimish. What do you think is the reason behind this interest in exploded form?
Well, at a certain point, the traditional narrative of having a kind of an arc and resolution is very much based on the Victorian novel, and what I've been attempting to write for 15 years was a novel about Victorian times, which I was also attempting to resolve traditionally. And at a certain point, I kind of realised that the novel itself is a product of colonialism, and the novel itself doesn't really. Do you think? I think to some extent. Well, the form that we call. A lot of novels are based on that kind of three-act structure, the kind of novels that really were kind of embraced during the Victorian age, I think, and have particular narrative modes that I think make it harder to really question history or something. I haven't totally worked out what I mean by it, but that is what, and I feel that Virginia Woolf and other modernist writers did actually attempt to challenge the old-fashioned novel.
Yes,
and then people forget, but we tend to hark back more to those...
to realism.
To realism.
Yes. And Virginia's Ghost expresses disappointment that she feels the contemporary novel has receded from experimentalism and modernism. Do you share that feeling? Do you feel
I didn't...
disappointed?
It wasn't a conscious, but I did find myself finding... I mean, with City of Trees, which is non-fiction, I've had this... the other thing that has impacted on my work was having my stepfather dying of dementia when he was quite young. It made me think a lot about narrative. Like, what do we remember about a life? What makes up a life? Because for him, time became mashed up. And he would remember some things very vividly and other things not at all. And... yet he still was himself in some essential way. So I had been starting to think about narrative, which is kind of why I wrote a collection of essays that were slightly disjointed. So I don't actually have a fully resolved sense of what I mean by it, but I find it hard to write novels, I'm finding, obviously.
I think you've done pretty well, actually. But it is interesting, isn't it? 2022, exactly 100 years after 1922, which is the big modernist year with, Ulysses and Jacob's Room and...
which Leonard published some of those modernist novels, not Ulysses, but
yeah. So it's a kind of interesting moment, I think, historically, for literary history. But you mentioned your father dying and the dementia that preceded that. And, this novel, like all novels, has certain sort of big themes that are up front, and then there's always sort of other things that simmer away kind of just under the surface. And it strikes me that one of those things in this novel, that sort of slightly underground theme, has to do with bodies and aging and illness. I have actually always been a big fan of Patrick White and novels like The Vivisector, which is very much about those things. I am aging. No.
But you do find yourself thinking about these things when I turn 60 next year, which is like I sang out loud to try and make it seem
so young.
real. But because there's something weird, and particularly actually with the British, there was something weirdly physical about their lives. So on the one hand, they're kind of these highfalutin creative types. On the other hand, they're kind of still using... They don't wash. They're using buckets to go to the loo in. They need servants to carry everything around. It's extremely cold. And Virginia Woolf, another, around the time of her suicide, had also been an painfully cold winter when there was no energy, when it was hard to get heating, which is, I know, was similar with Sylvia Plath. I mean, these kind of, the body, the relationship between the body and how we feel about the world is just essential. And also, I think something, one of the things that was useful about the fact that they didn't have a conventional sexual life meant that you could explore other ways in which the bodies express themselves.
Yeah.
I think.
And also connected to that, and connected to the unconventional sex lives and so on, is, I think, that another sort of underground concept is the one of unconventional family. Yeah. And how you...
Queer families, which is one of the really interesting things that Bloomsbury said. One of the things I most admired about Virginia, really, was that after both her parents died relatively young, when she was about 19, she and her sister, Vanessa, basically moved into a group household with their brothers and men they weren't related to, and threw parties and made art, and it was incredibly shocking at the time. But they basically, I'm reading and thinking, oh my God, they created the group household. I can't believe this. And because family had been so problematic for Virginia in particular with her, well, there's just so much death because there weren't as many vaccines and people and war and all these things. I mean, both she and Leonard lost a lot of their family members, and so their friends became their family, which is something that's always been very important to me, is my friendship group being, in a way, my family is important, but my friendship group is more important in some ways, and also not having children, all kinds of these, which we now call kind of queer family making, but I don't think you have to be queer to come up with that approach to making family.
Yeah, well, one of the things I loved was the way that was reflected in the Alice strand by Alice's surrogate mother, Hen, who steps in when Alice's parents are not around for whatever reason.
Yes. And that was part of what I was doing with Hen, who was a totally fictional character, but we did have a neighbour when we were growing up who could have been Hen, if my parents had magically disappeared or whatever.
Yeah.
Where people just end up taking over the parenting of people. And the fact that I had a kind of, it's not actually very unconventional at all, but people was brought up by, different people who call themselves my father, meant that I just realised how fluid notions of family are anyway.
Yeah, yeah. I will open it up to everyone else in a minute, but I do want to ask you about your process, Sophie, because this is a novel that you spent almost 2 decades writing. I love the fact that, Alice talking about the creative life, it makes the sort of point that often gets overlooked about the importance of economics. So, Alice has to stop working on her novel at times because she has to earn money.
Yes, that's true.
And so she has to do other things instead. But I'm just wondering, first of all, how did you keep track of all the material? Did you just forget things? Was it useful in the end to have a long process?
I did just forget things, but I was very methodical the whole time, so I had kept very extensive notes, and what I actually stopped doing was going back to the notes.
Yeah, okay.
So that I could properly forget it, so that I could reimagine it.
Yeah.
But I was fairly, because I was fairly diligent. I also did because all the John Hughes stuff happened just as I was going to the printer. I put this book through plagiarism, or Bridget, my editor, put the book through plagiarism software, which was really, I was quite relieved because I thought, who knows what I've done? I don't know. Like, I've been working on this for so long. It's possible
I've probably rewriting
entire passages that have come from Victoria Glendinning or something, and I just don't know what I've forgotten. So I was very relieved to find that I hadn't I plagiarised myself quite a lot. Some of my non-fiction, and some of the footnotes had been a bit reliant on Wikipedia, which we attended to. But I hadn't actually plagiarised other historians or indeed Leonard. And I did spent a lot of money and time getting permission to use all the quotes that I used from Virginia and Leonard, and there's a couple from Vita Sackville, West and Lytton Strachey as well. Yeah. So I was just aware of how those things can both blow up in your face.
Yeah. But in a way, it was the length of the gestation that allowed the novel to get to its final shape. Yeah. So it sort of shifted shape over that time too, didn't it? Yeah.
And it just took as much time. And in a way, I knew that it had found its time when this devastating fever stopped being a reference to Leonard's description of lust, and actually became a devastating fever by the pandemic. I thought, I think I'm done now. I think I can just go with that double entendre and just lean into it. But I felt like it was almost like I waited until the title found its moment.
Just one last thing. So you start by saying that Virginia doesn't have the measure of Leonard, of her husband, although they've been married for so long. Do you feel you have the measure of Leonard?
I feel that I do, yes. I feel in some ways that I know him better than I know myself, I would say. I feel extraordinarily familiar with him.
Fond of him?
I'm very fond of him.
Yes, good. I am too.
And the fonder I got of him, the more I could actually be a bit mean about him or be critical of him, because I felt more secure in my relationship with him.
Okay. So I'll open it up to Charlotte.
It's about the title, Sophie. So I think when I first met you, maybe around 15 years ago or so, you said you were writing about Leonard Woolf and you had this title, This Devastating Fever. And I remember saying that is the best title of a book ever. And I want to know, you've talked a bit about what he meant by it, but how did that just stick with you the whole time?
Yes, I didn't. I think I briefly thought of calling it Once in 100 Years. For reasons to do with bushfire and pandemic, and because it was sort of set over 100 years apart, but I couldn't really let go of This Devastating Fever.
And was it a kind of guiding?
Yes, it was. There's certain kind of ideas that I couldn't let. I think you always have to find that. And I know you've written about this, Charlotte. Kind of like a thread that keep you going. And when there's so many facts and so much real information, if you like, that it ends up being a novel really about feelings rather than and things that capture the feelings around particular issues. And I don't write a lot about his socialism. I write a lot about his gardening. So I kind of chose more emotional aspects of his life to write about. I left out just extraordinary amount.
Well, you have to.
You have to. He lived till 90, so. Yeah.
And I just want to ask quickly, did you, because Alice, Charlotte's question reminded me of it, of the long creative process. Alice loses faith in her novel at times. Did you?
Yes, I did.
And how did you?
Well, when I actually lived in America, I actually just stopped thinking about it, and I worked on City of Trees. So I didn't exactly make a decision not to work on it, but I did just stop thinking about it. And then, in fact, when I moved back to Australia, I found out that one of the best archives of Virginia Woolf material was at the Berg Library, which was about 10 minutes from where I'd been living for a year. And I hadn't even, I was like, no. But I just it had just totally gone out of my head. It's probably not a bad thing that I didn't end up going into that archive. But the only thing that really kept me going was bloody-mindedness, because occasionally a few people had said to me, I don't think you'll ever finish it. And I was like, no. Fuck you. I'm going to finish this.
Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, Jane.
Oh, I have a similar, almost Charlotte's question, but again with a slightly personal bent, because I'm obsessed with that title as well and have loved it ever since I heard of it. I feel I've sort of grown up with you and This Devastating.
Yeah.
But I'm so interested about the fact that an extract was published, was it in the Angel? 20 years ago?
Yeah, Robin, yeah.
Which I was so in love with.
The ploughing, yeah.
So it felt like you couldn't not finish this book and publish it because of me. Because of that. No, but I wonder how that affected you as well, having had already some of it out in the world.
Oh yes,
was
no.
That good or bad? Or
no,
was
it was.
Anchor? Was that?
It was good, but it actually meant that when I had a realisation that some of it I just had to, even if it was good writing, I had to go because it didn't relate to. It didn't make it into a novel. It made that a bit harder because I had actually written a lot of.
Because you had to lose.
Good. Well, I ended up just not losing it, to be honest, but I kept thinking I should lose it because it was well written and I thought I've worked so hard on it. Mm-hmm. But I do think that writers probably need to be better than I am at dropping stuff, because just because it's well written doesn't necessarily mean it works. So they're probably, in terms of the texture of a man's life, there's a lot more about Salon than really quite makes sense, but because I just couldn't let go of it. Yeah.
Well, it was important for Leonard.
Yeah.
So from that point of view.
Yeah, it did form. It totally formed him in some ways.
Yeah. Patty, you had a question.
I did, yeah. I was just thinking, because of what you said about the novel as a maybe a colonial construct,
Yeah.
and it jumped in my head to Roland Barthes saying that the novel was a bourgeois construct.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, no, it's not, Roland, it existed before.
Yeah.
And I was thinking that when you said that it existed before, and I was thinking what it's about is that kind of traditional novel, in essence, is about that things make sense. And it seemed to me, were you kind of struggling with a way to write a shaped novel without saying everything made sense?
Yes, maybe that's it, because certainly things don't make sense.
No, I don't.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably a good way of articulating.
Yeah, so how do you...
It's like, and that's what, like, I didn't really know how to end it, because I certainly didn't want to have a nice resolution at the end, but I didn't want it to be terribly miserable either. But it's
you
like,
had to come up with a new kind of a form, really, that was saying, no, things don't make sense, but we can still make things.
but it's also why I had lists, it's also why I had footnotes, because some of the footnotes are just research that was so interesting that I
Yes.
was going to put it in there no matter, but make a bit of a joke at my own expense maybe, for not being able to let go of it.
Yeah, well, I guess it's partly a sense of, the contemporary sense of the world falling apart.
Yes.
Means, the art form falls apart as well. Sorry, Bernadette, you had a
I was just
question.
interested in this point, and you keep saying it's about colonialism, but Alice's therapist says to her, look, your problem with the novel is it's to do with patriarchy. And Alice says, look...
My therapist did actually say
But to me, that seems to make more sense, because what you're actually saying in this novel is, well, fuck that, because it's not going to make sense, and I'm not going to give you some sort of patriarchal sort of power thing. But so what I'm interested in is does patriarchy and colonialism...
well, they are related, and Leonard is very much a kind of both. A patriarch, and even though I say he's a patriarch, he has but he also was.
He undermines it, doesn't he?
He was a very feminine role in terms of how he positioned himself, in terms of his relationships and those kind of things. So and in relationship with his male friends as well.
Yeah, so maybe the novel's more of a celebration of his fluidity.
Well, I mean, I think storytelling is obviously ageless, and maybe maybe the word you use. Maybe the issue is realism. I don't actually know. Like, I didn't end up, like when I was talking about how I wrote it, I was not necessarily articulating clearly worked out positions when I was finishing it. James?
But I mean, they're all connected to those kind of modes of concealment that Gosh talks about in the novel, which are absolutely connected to kind of colonialism and patriarchy.
Yeah.
And the way that what it does is bourgeois novel disguises the kind of systems of violence and the weirdness of the world by kind of damping them down. So it gives you something that looks like life, which actually takes everything out. So you don't see slavery, you don't see, the machinery that's driving it, which is behind it. So,
And
I think they're all.
It's actually what one of the first public readings I did from this novel quite a few years ago was actually the salt mining scene, which was important. It's a very tiny scene, but it's quite important to me because it is effectively a form of slavery, which Leonard was responsible for overseeing. But I read it, and then people said, it's so boring. I felt a little downcast, I have to say. But because these things aren't always, you kind of, so maybe proper realism rather than fake realism, yeah.
Well, I mean, the realist novel...
Real realism,
Yeah. I'm quite keen in some ways on the realist novel because it does allow us to give voice to positions, to people who haven't been heard of traditionally. So, in the last 50 years, I mean, it's fine to sneer at the rehabilitation of the realist novel, but that has really happened through, giving voice to female experience, for instance,
Yeah.
and then the experiences of various minority groups.
Yeah.
So there is a place for both, obviously.
Yeah, no, look, it's an interesting question. It's just, I found that towards the end, we need to wrap up, I think, in a sec, but towards the very end, it's one of the reasons why I stopped writing it as a novel about colonialism exactly, because in a way it's not my job. It's the job of the people from those countries who've been colonised, not the job, but the kind of the right of them to write about those experiences. And I was living in Mount Macedon, which is beautiful mountains, but also these amazing colonial gardens from the 1840s, and like oak trees everywhere, and there's stag and there's foxes. And I realised in that way the wheel turns with life that I was living next door to this massive settlement that my forebears had established at the bottom of Mount Macedon.
Wow.
Which had been wetlands of traditional owners, and I just really thought, it's not just Leonard who was a colonialist. It was very much, like, we're all implicated. Yes. So I think that also just was all, I was thinking about all that at once and just kind of dismantled everything. But I do think that we really need to. I want to thank you, Michelle.
Oh, no, I think there's one last question.
One question, sorry.
Yeah.
Why Leonard?
Why Leonard? I don't even. Why him? Well, it's just he was the one I found that kind of, triggered these. I mean, it's a good question actually, because it's possible that any interesting historical figure might have become my kind of through line into thinking about a lot of these things. But because I do think he just, in a way, is a kind of a way of me thinking about a whole lot of things that are really interesting to me, and I was kind of stuck with him. I don't know. We met in a bar.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Sophie, for your generosity in answering all these questions. And thank you all for being here. And please go and buy this book at once. Buy 2 copies.
And, or one is fine.
What do you think? No, I think if one is a present. Christmas is not far. How many sleeps till Christmas? About 90? That's not much.
And look, can I thank Roaring Stories? I actually want to thank Bridget from Ultimo Press, who was my publisher and was amazing, and Jane, who I have, Novak, who has been my agent and helped.
And is not Sarah. And is not
Sarah. But did give me belief in this book, because she read it and was like, yeah, no, it works. And I just actually collapsed onto the kitchen floor crying when I got there. So, and thank you, Michelle. Thank you.
Well,